What if FDR had been a Republican? Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of the most recognizable figures in American political history. As a Democratic president during the Great Depression and World War II, his leadership came to define the modern Democratic Party and the philosophy of government intervention in public welfare. But let's step into an alternate reality. What if FDR had been a Republican? How would that shift have influenced his landmark policies, the political makeup of the nation, and even the trajectory of global history? This thought experiment explores not only the structural dynamics of leadership and party ideology, but also the broader implications of reshaping one of America's most transformative presidencies. To fully reimagine Roosevelt as a Republican, we first need to understand the political landscape of the 1930s. The Great Depression had gripped the world, devastating economies and leaving millions unemployed. The American public was disillusioned with the laissez-faire economic strategy of FDR's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, a Republican. Hoover's reluctance to embrace government intervention caused widespread dissatisfaction with the Republican Party during that era. On the other hand, the Democratic Party of the time was coalescing around more progressive ideas. While party ideologies were less rigid than today, Democrats were generally associated with a willingness to embrace radical measures to address the Depression. Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York, rode into office promising bold action, giving birth to the New Deal, a series of programs aimed at economic recovery and social reform. But what if we flip the script? If Roosevelt belonged to the Republican Party, he would have had to navigate a very different political atmosphere. His ideas would have collided with Republican doctrines of limited government and fiscal conservatism, leading to fundamental divergences in American policy. This alternate timeline begs the question: are leaders shaped by their parties, or do transformative leaders reshape the parties they lead? FDR's personal leadership style centered on pragmatism. He was willing to experiment and innovate, prioritizing results over strict adherence to ideology. But could this pragmatism have thrived within the traditional Republican framework of the 1930s? Or would Roosevelt, as a Republican, have molded the party to accommodate his vision of broad government intervention? After all, transformative leaders often disrupt norms. For example, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, fundamentally altered his party by steering it toward abolitionism during the Civil War. Still, this scenario raises another question. Would a Republican Roosevelt face more resistance within his own party, given his proclivity for sweeping federal programs? While Roosevelt was undoubtedly a leader with deep convictions, the partisan infrastructure of the time often constrained or enabled presidents. Here lies the tension between individual agency and collective party identity. Nowhere does the tension between Roosevelt's pragmatism and Republican ideology become more evident than in the case of the New Deal. The plan was Roosevelt's signature response to the economic devastation of the Great Depression, introducing large-scale public works projects, stronger labor protections, financial sector reforms, and the establishment of Social Security. Had Roosevelt been a Republican, it's worth questioning whether such an extensive program would ever have come to fruition. Republican principles in the 1930s typically called for smaller government and reduced public spending. Would Social Security, a landmark policy of social welfare, have survived or even been proposed under a Republican FDR? It's possible that his party would have sought private sector solutions instead, stressing individual responsibility over collective safety nets. On the other hand, Republican values of fiscal efficiency might have led to a more streamlined, less bureaucratic New Deal. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Public Works Administration may have been scaled down or altered to align more closely with Republican ideals of minimizing federal overreach. Interestingly, history offers us examples of Republican presidents who embraced interventionist policies during times of crisis. Theodore Roosevelt, the progressive Republican president of the early 20th century, pioneered reforms that many saw as bold and at odds with traditional party ideals. Could a Republican FDR have followed the same pattern, dragging his party reluctantly toward more centralized economic solutions? Or would he have compromised, creating a New Deal that looked significantly more conservative? One of the most significant areas of divergence in this scenario would likely have been FDR's economic policies. the Democratic Roosevelt heavily relied on Keynesian economic theory, advocating for government spending to stimulate demand and pull the economy out of crisis. Under a Republican FDR, however, the emphasis might have shifted toward supply-side economics, focusing on tax cuts for businesses to encourage job creation and investment. This approach aligns more closely with traditional Republican ideologies. A Republican FDR may have avoided massive public works projects, instead encouraging private enterprise to spearhead recovery efforts. Would this strategy have succeeded? It's difficult to say. The severity of the Great Depression arguably demanded large-scale intervention, something even conservative economists of the time occasionally acknowledged. Without public works programs, millions of Americans would have been left without jobs. Alternatively, a focus on free market solutions could have accelerated recovery in sectors where government intervention created inefficiencies. This could spark discussions among political scholars about the efficacy of intervention versus market freedom during economic crises. Would a Republican FDR achieve the same end goals as the real-world New Deal, albeit through vastly different means? FDR's presidency was not defined solely by domestic policy. It also encompassed a groundbreaking approach to foreign affairs during World War II. His entry into the conflict, despite initial resistance from isolationist factions, marked a turning point in America's role on the global stage. But how might this approach have differed under a Republican Roosevelt? In the 1930s, many Republicans supported isolationism, advocating for America to stay neutral in European conflicts. A Republican FDR may have faced stronger pressure to avoid involvement in the war, potentially delaying crucial measures like the Lend-Lease program that provided vital aid to allied nations. Alternatively, Roosevelt's ability to galvanize public opinion and rally Congress might have overridden party orthodoxy, leading to a similar progression toward intervention. After all, leadership often transcends partisanship in times of crisis. This segment of alternate history raises fascinating questions about leadership and the partisan framing of foreign policy. Could a Republican FDR have redefined his party's stance on internationalism, forging a new era of bipartisan consensus? Or would his Republican background have deepened America's isolationist tendencies, changing the course of World War II? A Republican FDR would not only have reshaped his party, but also the Democratic Party, forcing it to evolve in response. If Republicans had taken the mantle of government intervention during the Great Depression, the Democrats may have adopted a more conservative platform to differentiate themselves. This reversal of roles could have resulted in a political landscape unrecognizable to modern observers. The long-term impacts are equally fascinating to consider. Would America have seen the same progressive labor and civil rights movements without the groundwork laid by FDR's democratic vision? Could the Republican Party have become the dominant force in American politics, holding onto the legacy of the New Deal instead of opposing it in later decades? This alternate reality forces us to reevaluate how pivotal moments in history hinge not just on individuals, but on the systems and institutions surrounding them. Franklin Roosevelt is remembered today as the architect of modern liberalism. His belief in the power of government to uplift society became the foundation of the Democratic Party's identity. But this thought experiment challenges us to think deeper. Was FDR's legacy a result of his Democratic affiliation, or his ability to adapt and innovate in the face of unprecedented challenges? History is full of leaders who defied traditional party expectations. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, expanded Social Security and invested heavily in infrastructure through the interstate highway system. Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat, pushed for civil rights while escalating a war in Vietnam, a stance that alienated elements of his liberal base. Would FDR's flexibility and problem-solving have helped him break the mold of Republican orthodoxy, creating a legacy that transcends partisanship? Or would his bold ideas have withered under the conservative pressures of his party? Ultimately, this scenario invites discussions about the nature of political leadership. Are leaders products of their party platforms, or do great leaders redefine the ideologies they represent? In the context of today's polarized climate, this question becomes even more urgent. The alignment between leaders and their parties seems more rigid than ever. But history reminds us that transformative leaders often blur these lines, challenging conventional wisdom and forcing us to reconsider what party labels truly mean. By reimagining FDR as a Republican, we're not only exploring alternate history, but also sparking a broader conversation about the role of ideology in decision-making, the flexibility of leadership, and how one individual can reshape the course of history. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency changed the nation and the world in ways few could have predicted. Reimagining him as a Republican invites us to think critically about the intersection of leadership and partisanship. Could the policies that defined FDR's legacy have emerged from a different ideological framework? Would Republican values have constrained his vision, or would his leadership have forged a new path for the party? This thought experiment doesn't seek definitive answers, but encourages deeper reflection. By questioning the possibilities of what could have been, we gain greater insight into what was, and greater clarity on the role of leadership in shaping the future. What would America and the world look like if FDR had been a Republican? That question is your invitation to think, debate, and engage with the forces of history and politics that continue to shape our society today. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.